Today is the last Sunday of the church year. Next Sunday is First Advent, and that sends us into a new liturgical year. The appointed text for this last Sunday is the text of the Last Judgment. And it's actually a rare word from Jesus. Jesus just doesn't talk much about a final reckoning or a last judgment. His focus is the presence of God in the day and the people at hand. So, because this is an uncommon word from Jesus, we ought to listen carefully. We only get one chance to get it. So what does he say? What Jesus says is that when we cared for others, when they were hungry, thirsty, or a stranger, without clothing or locked in the rig, we ministered to him who knew hunger and thirst and betrayal, no place to lay his head, arrest, and worse. Such is the way of God's reign, and such is the criterion by which we are judged. Bonhoeffer's echo is this: the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. But Pastor Talitha, as usual, suggests a twist. We have been seen. We have been cared for. We have been on the receiving end of the gift of life. What was that like? What is that like? Three persons, Pam Hyde, Dave Wilkerson, and Nancy Witter, will share their reflection on this way of hearing the parable. So note that this is also our moment of reflection about care received. So there will be a period of silence after each of the offerings, as well as song, and time for silence at the end as well, before together we'll sing number 499, Pues si vividos, in English and Spanish. Gail Anderson will share the reading of the Last Judgment.
Then Jesus told this parable. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" Word of God, word of life.
Interestingly, I don't remember her name. I was around 14 or 15, about the age of the youth initiates that I work with now. I'd grown up in a conservative Southern Baptist church in Bible Belt, Missouri, where strict adherence to rules about living and beliefs was expected. I, along with many of my friends, were baptized at the church. We sang in the adult choir. We were sometimes asked to speak or sing at church on a Sunday morning, and we didn't dance or go to school parties because that was a sin. My father was a deacon, and my mother was my Sunday school teacher. But that church, like any church, was made up of flawed human beings who often got it wrong, even when they were trying really hard to get it right. Having grown up in that environment, it never occurred to me that my small nuclear family of my dad, my mother, my older brother, and me could be anything but that, or that my idyllic, albeit relatively simple life to that point could be shattered by the actions of others, including many I love dearly. But it was. My father left his traveling insurance salesman job to join with a friend in a local insurance company business that allowed my dad to be home more. His business partner's wife also worked in the business with them, while my mom worked as a sales clerk at the local Sears store. The business partner's oldest daughter was my brother's girlfriend, and his youngest daughter was my best friend. Needless to say, our families were pretty entwined. My life was anchored in my church and in those two families, along with other friends at school, but especially at church. So it was totally surprising and devastating night when I came home from choir practice one night to find my mother sobbing uncontrollably and learned that my father's business partner, who also was a volunteer law enforcement officer, had arranged to have police officers stake out a local hotel because he thought his wife and my father were having an affair. He caught them in a very public way and outed them in their trysting place. I won't begin to tell you all about what happened after that, other than to say my parents were divorced. My father and his business partner's wife got and stayed married for over 45 years until he died a few years ago. And my mother finally remarried a husband, a wonderful guy from our church whose wife had died, and he became a terrific husband to my mom and a model stepfather to me and my brother, truly somebody who fed me in many, many ways. But when I was 15 and all this was happening, I was embarrassed and confused and scared and completely unhinged by the betrayal of those I loved and all I'd been taught to believe. To make matters worse, the church choir director, whom I really respected, made a pass at one of my young friends in the church basement. Sound familiar? And the pastor, whom I also loved and admired and who was heading for a major missionary assignment overseas, became ill and died suddenly at a very young age. I was suffering a lot of losses without a lot of remaining anchors in my life. Not everyone knew what was happening. You just didn't talk about such things back then, even though the discovery of the affair had been blasted countywide on the CB radio for all to hear. Some people in my church just told me to smile, and God would take care of things, or to trust in God because he would always be there. Well, it sure didn't feel like it to me, as a young adolescent girl whose life had been turned upside down. But there was one person who was there for me, even if she didn't know it. The organ player at our church was a woman who was quiet, talented, and steady. She was there at choir practice, at Wednesday night church services, and every service, morning and night on Sundays. She sometimes gave me a ride home from choir practice, and along the way, she listened to me. I don't remember much about what she ever said to me. In fact, I mostly remember her not saying much of anything. I suspect she had no idea what to say to comfort me or help me, and she didn't try. She was just there for me, an adult woman who was dependable, non-judging of anyone involved in any of these situations, and not trying to make herself the center of anything. Without even knowing it, she fed me with her presence, her constancy, and her kind and listening ear and spirit. I think of her from time to time and wonder if she ever had any idea what she meant to me or how important she was to a youth whose world had been upended and who needed support and care from an adult she could depend on. It took me a long time to get through and over all that happened during those years, and it literally took me decades to get back to God and especially back to the church, United Church. But I did, and that organ player is part of the reason. She fed me when I hungered. Without her, my soul would likely not have survived or thrived. I give thanks to her and to God for showing her the way to show me the way.
One of the many angels who fed me when I was hungry was Ralph Boyer. I first met Ralph Boyer when I was in high school in Carlsbad, New Mexico in the 1950s. He was better known as Coach Boyer and also as Uncle Ralph. He was Uncle Ralph to my high school sweetheart, Viv, and Uncle Ralph guided both Viv and me through our young lives together in school, as well as the frequent family gatherings that I was brought into with Viv's family. Viv and I got married in our sophomore year of college, and I could then call Coach Boyer Uncle. Uncle Ralph was an exceptional athlete at the University of New Mexico and one of New Mexico's outstanding high school coaches, winning state championships in both basketball and football year after year. Fast forward to 1995, Viv and I are living in New York, and unfortunately, Viv had been battling cancer for 12 years and had a recurrence that year that took her life. Viv and I had a design business together, and after she died, I found it difficult to sustain the business by myself for a number of reasons. After struggling a couple of years in New York, I decided to move back to New Mexico. I landed in Albuquerque in 1997 with a moving van full of furniture and a couple of leftover clients from New York that I hoped would keep me in business to survive in New Mexico, and they did. This is where Uncle Ralph again becomes one of the many angels in my life. Uncle Ralph's wife, Mickey, had also died of cancer some years before, and he was now living in Albuquerque. He really took me under his wing, suggesting that I take up golf. He said he had a group of former players and coaches that got together every Tuesday and Thursday morning at Arroyo Delos golf course. And they always needed extra players. And I was greeted by guys who accepted me and encouraged me because I was Ralph's nephew. And believe me, I needed encouragement because my golf game was nowhere near theirs. One guy who became a lifelong friend, Mike Enright, always said to me, "We're not playing golf, we're just fellowshipping." Uncle Ralph was also a painter, and he always was working on a painting of something. He gave away his paintings to family and friends, and it was another area he encouraged me to rekindle my interest in. So I took up watercolor painting, and again have enjoyed following Ralph's example of giving my paintings to relatives and friends. Uncle Ralph died a few years ago at the age of 92, and I had played golf with him just a week before. I don't remember the score or what was said, but I sure remember his encouragement and how good he always made me feel. Thank you, Coach and Uncle Ralph Boyer. You truly fed me when I was hungry.
When Talitha asked Dave and me if we'd be part of this service, she asked if we'd be reflectors. Well, we're both pretty literal minded, so we thought that had something to do with mirrors. We'd probably hold up mirrors to all of you to look at yourselves, and then Larry, in his message, would brilliantly incorporate that somehow. Well, we thought about this. Sure, no problem for us. We can do that. As we realized it would be a little more complicated than that, we had to give it some thought. And for me, one person immediately came to mind. You know who that person was? Mr. Rogers. Remember Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on childhood television? A bit of truly brilliant advice that Mr. Rogers gave was, look for the helpers. Always look for the helpers. In any difficult situation, always look for the people who are working to make it better. So I'd like to tell you a bit about some of the saints, some of the helpers in my own life who've been there when I needed them most. In my mid-20s, I married Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Al Taylor, whom I'd met when we were both in grad school at Purdue. Al was a big 6'4", strapping, healthy, brilliant guy. Together we had a son, Christopher Kent. And when the baby Chris was 9 months old, Al very suddenly died. It was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot to the lung. I was way, way, way beyond devastation. But thank you, Jesus, the saints arrived. Certainly there was my family, and my mom and dad immediately flew out from Iowa. But there were others too, each doing what they could in their big and little ways, be it listening, advising, caring for the baby, bringing food, whatever. I remember, for instance, one older friend, Jan Cruzel. She said to me the first day of the day that Al died, "What are you going to wear to the funeral?" Well, I had no idea. I was busy trying to just get to the next minute, certainly not thinking about funeral clothes. So Jan went to my closet, found a simple black dress, took it home with her. She lengthened it to a more appropriate length. We wore short skirts back then. Had it dry cleaned, and she brought it back to me for the funeral. She was one of my helpers. Jan has long since died, but I still very gratefully remember her kindness. Another dear friend, Dolly Reinhardt, intuitively understood that sitting alone in church after Elle's death would be tough. So she called to say, let's always look for each other on Sunday mornings and sit together. And so we did. Thank you, Dolly, for your help and your sensitivity. Other helpers come to mind. Among them are my brother and my dad. Chris was 9 months old when his father died, so he has no memory of him. And I was very, very worried about my son growing up with a solid, steady role model. So I turned to my brother, KJ, and my dad, both of whom live back in Iowa. And from every single year, from when Chris was 2 years old until he was in college, he went back and spent part of each summer in Iowa with my brother, KJ, and my dad, and they very lovingly taught him how to be a man. Though Dad has since died, Chris's loving memory of him goes on, and his bond with his uncle KJ is forever strong and enduring. I am very grateful. By the way, KJ's name is Kent. Son Christopher Kent is named after him. And one more example I'd like to share, and this involves my second husband, Bill Witter. He and I were in Smith's grocery store one day, and we encountered a young woman who was screaming and hitting, slapping her child, a toddler. I was stunned and shaken, and I didn't know what to do. But fortunately, Bill had more presence of mind, and he went over to the woman, calmly put his hand on her shoulder, and said, "This really looks overwhelming. Is there something I can do to help?" His interruption and gentle words immediately ended the chaos. The woman stopped screaming, toddler stopped crying, and we then chatted a bit with them both before we all went on peacefully about our shopping. Not only the mom and child benefited, but I did too. I saw and learned how a calm and helpful intervention can diffuse a very negative situation, and I am very grateful for that lesson. And finally, in my pantheon of personal saints and helpers, another comes to mind, and that's Pete Seeger. I like to think of him as St. Pete. Just as Mr. Rogers' advice to always look for the helpers is a touchstone in my life, so too is Pete Seeger's wonderful song. When we look and we see things are not as they should be, God's counting on you, and God's counting on me.